The story will be told from the perspective of the main female character.
The police, go ahead, call them if you dare. For a brief moment, fear flickered in my sister's eyes, but she quickly covered it with a defiant smile and snatched her phone from the table. Fine, if that's what you want. I'll tell the police that this woman is trying to ruin our Christmas party. As her trembling fingers dialed the number, the room fell into an unnatural silence. The husband's family exchanged uneasy glances, realizing at last that this was no ordinary argument. About 20 minutes later, through the window, I saw the flash of red and blue lights reflecting off the snow outside the house. When I answered the heavy knock at the door, 2 police officers stood there, both looking earnest and professional. Their eyes swept over the chaotic scene inside before settling on me and my sister with clear suspicion. "We got a report. What exactly is going on here?" one of them asked. Seizing the moment, my sister raised her shrill voice. "It's her. She barged in out of nowhere and ruined our vacation. She's a stalker." "She's my sister," I interrupted, keeping my tone calm and steady. "And this is my house. They entered the property without my permission." The 2 officers exchanged puzzled looks. "That's a lie. This is our house," my sister screamed, her voice cracking. I sighed softly and opened the briefcase I always carried for work. From inside, I pulled out several documents, the deed proving ownership of the lake house, property tax receipts, and my identification. Without a word, I handed them to one of the officers. He examined each page carefully under the beam of his flashlight. "Those are fake, obviously fake," my sister shrieked. But the officer's expression didn't change. After a moment, he looked up, handed the documents back to me, and turned a stern gaze toward my sister and her husband. "Ma'am, if these documents are legitimate, this property belongs to Audrey Pearson, this lady here. That means you and your family are staying here without her consent. Under Oregon law, this could constitute unlawful trespassing." At his words, the color drained from my sister's face. At the same time, the husband's mother collapsed weakly onto the floor. "Oh my goodness, we were deceived by our own son and his wife. I'm so terribly sorry." She apologized sincerely to me, her voice trembling with guilt. I accepted her apology quietly, then spoke firmly without hesitation. "Thank you for your words. However, whether you were deceived or not is no longer the issue for me. As a matter of fact, your family occupied my most private space without my permission. And above all, because you were here, I endured the worst humiliation of my life, being insulted by my own sister in my own home. For that reason alone, I can no longer keep you in this house." The husband flailed, stammering, "Well, we were having Christmas." "Because we're family, we should be allowed to use it," my sister shouted as a last-ditch protest. "We're blood-related sisters." At that, the officer shook his head in genuine disbelief. "Unfortunately, family ties are not a get-out-of-jail-free card for trespassing. Miss Pearson, what would you like us to do? Do you want them removed?" All eyes stabbed into me. My sister's eyes were wet with anger and humiliation. I stared back at her steadily, and for a moment I thought of our mother. Her last words had been a plea for me to support my sister so she wouldn't go astray. To honor that promise, I had supported my sister and the others all this time. I swallowed her wasteful spending and her husband's failures. It wasn't weakness, it was a sister's sense of duty. But I had reached my limit. I nodded quietly. "Yes, I want all of them to leave my house immediately." "Then please pack your things," one of the officers said after a nod. The living room filled with despairing sighs and small curses. Amid that, I calmly took out my smartphone and unlocked it. The blue-white glow of the screen illuminated my composed face. The movement of my sister and the others, who had reluctantly begun packing their belongings at the officer's prompting, stopped dead. Every gaze in the room was fixed on the smartphone in my hand. The app I had opened was the high-security banking application I used for managing my assets. Without addressing anyone in particular, yet speaking clearly enough for everyone to hear, I began narrating my actions step by step. "First, the apartment you're living in is one of the properties I own. If rented at market price, it would be worth $2,700 a month, but I let you have it for the cost of maintenance alone. I did that because I believed it was my final responsibility as your sister. That privilege ends today." When I tapped the confirmation screen, a sterile digital chime echoed through the room. My sister dropped the Christmas ornament she had been holding. "You're joking, right?" Her voice trembled. "Feel free to dial the authorities if you think that will help," I challenged her. For a split second, I saw a flash of terror in my sister's eyes, but she masked it with a smirk of defiance and grabbed her phone from the coffee table. "Fine, have it your way. I'll just explain to the officers that some crazy woman is trying to crash our holiday party." While her trembling fingers punched in the number, a heavy, uncomfortable silence filled the room. The husband's family members looked at each other with growing doubt, finally realizing this was more than a petty sibling spat. Roughly 20 minutes later, I noticed the reflection of emergency lights, red and blue, glinting off the snow banks outside. When a loud knock echoed through the house, I opened the door to find two professional-looking police officers. They scanned the messy living room before looking at me and my sister with clear suspicion. One of them asked for an explanation of the situation. My sister immediately took the floor, her voice reaching a shrill pitch. "It's her. She just showed up out of nowhere to harass us and ruin our vacation. She's a stalker." "She is my biological sister," I said, cutting her off with a steady, quiet voice. "And more importantly, this is my property. These people are here without any authorization." The officers looked back and forth between us, appearing puzzled. "That's a total lie. This house belongs to us," my sister shrieked, her voice nearly breaking. I didn't argue. Instead, I calmly reached into the work briefcase I had brought with me. I pulled out several official folders, the property deed, recent tax receipts, and my government ID. I handed the stack to the lead officer. He clicked on his flashlight and spent a few minutes carefully reviewing every page. "Those are fakes. She's a fraud," my sister screamed. The officer ignored her. He looked up, returned the paperwork to me, and turned a hard gaze toward my sister and her husband. "Ma'am, based on these records, Audrey Pearson is the sole owner of this residence. That means you and your guests are currently here without the owner's permission. Under the laws of Oregon, this is a clear case of unlawful trespassing." When he said that, all the color left my sister's face. At that exact moment, the husband's mother sank weakly onto the rug. "Oh, Lord, our own son and his wife lied to us." She looked at me with genuine shame in her eyes and offered a trembling apology for their presence. I acknowledged her words with a small nod, but I didn't back down. "I appreciate the apology, but the circumstances haven't changed. Your family took over my most intimate space without asking. Beyond that, I had to stand in my own home and listen to my sister humiliate and insult me. Because of that, I cannot allow any of you to remain here tonight." Her husband started to stammer, waving his hands around. But it's Christmas. We were just celebrating. We're family. We have the right to be here because we're sisters." My sister yelled in a final, desperate attempt to stay. The officer shook his head, looking unimpressed. "Family status isn't a legal defense for trespassing, ma'am. Miss Pearson, do you want us to escort them off the property?" Everyone in the room stared at me. My sister's eyes were glassy with a mix of fury and embarrassment. I looked back at her and briefly remembered our mother's passing years ago. Her final request was for me to look after my sister because she was too naive and idealistic. I had kept that promise for a long time, quietly funding her wasteful life and her husband's constant failures. It wasn't because I was a pushover. It was out of a sense of duty to my late mother. But that night I hit my breaking point. I gave a firm nod. "Yes, I want every one of them out of my house right now." "Start packing your bags," the officer ordered. The room was suddenly filled with the sound of hushed swearing and heavy sighs. While they began to move, I pulled out my smartphone and unlocked it with my fingerprint. The cool, blue light of the screen lit up my face. My sister and the others stopped what they were doing and watched me. I opened my high-security banking and asset management app. I didn't look at them, but I made sure my voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "First, let's talk about the apartment you two live in. It's one of my rental units. Market rate for that place is $2,700 a month, but I've been letting you stay there for basically nothing out of sisterly obligation. That ends this very second." I pressed a button on the screen, and a sharp digital chime rang out in the quiet room. My sister dropped a holiday ornament she was holding. "You're kidding. You can't be serious," she whispered, her voice shaking. Next, I looked directly at the husband's parents, who were sitting hunched on the sofa. I asked if they remembered how they got their current apartment. I reminded them that I had found that property myself using my real estate expertise, without charging any commission, and had personally signed as their guarantor so they could move in. I had invested in that because I believed a stable home for them would eventually benefit their son. They averted their eyes, unable to meet my gaze because of their guilt. I looked back down at my screen. I mentioned the white SUV parked outside. My sister had begged me for it through tears, claiming it was necessary for her in-laws' doctor visits and grocery trips. I had covered the entire loan myself. Now they were using that very car to break into my house and call me a parasite. I announced that the loan payments were cancelled and that I would instruct the finance company to repossess the vehicle in the morning. After finishing my business on the phone, I met my sister's frozen eyes. She wasn't angry anymore, she looked completely terrified. I told her that the total I had given her over the years easily exceeded $60,000, but I wouldn't spend another cent on her from now on. She tried to speak, but her lips just quivered. Her husband simply stared at the floor in silence. His parents and siblings hurriedly gathered their belongings as if they were fleeing from a disaster. They made no more attempts to defend the couple. It was clear they only wanted to escape as quickly as possible. One of the officers tapped the husband on the shoulder and told them they needed to move before the roads froze over. The other officer looked at them sternly and asked if anyone was sober. He warned them that if everyone had been drinking, they would spend the night in jail for drunk driving instead of just trespassing. The husband's father awkwardly raised his hand and said he hadn't had anything to drink and would drive everyone home safely. My sister suddenly rushed toward me, begging me to think about Christmas and not throw them out into the blizzard. The officer caught her by the arm before she could reach me. He warned her that if she caused any more trouble, he would have to take her in for obstruction of justice. That final warning broke her. She almost collapsed, but her husband caught her. They picked up their coats and bags from the wreckage of the party, the spilled drinks, torn decorations, and scattered plates, and with their heads bowed like convicts, they slowly made their way toward the door. Just before it closed, my sister turned around and glared at me with eyes full of hatred and pleading. I met her gaze without a single change in expression. The heavy door thudded shut, and silence finally returned to the house. The officers left after telling me to call them if anything else happened. I stood alone in the middle of the ruined living room. The fire continued to flicker softly as if nothing had happened. I watched the police lights fade away through the window and took a long, heavy breath. My whole body felt like lead as the adrenaline drained away. I sank into the sofa and closed my eyes. Just a few hours ago, I had been looking forward to a peaceful holiday, but now that felt like a memory from another lifetime. The table was littered with dirty plates, half-empty glasses, and the bones of a turkey. I picked up the luxury glass my sister had been using, the same one I had given her for her birthday. As I looked at the red wine stain inside it, memories flooded back. When our parents passed away, I was in my early 30s and struggling to build my career. My sister was still a student then. She had lost the people she depended on most and was emotionally unstable. I had told her then that I would be her family from now on. That promise eventually became a heavy chain around my neck. Even after graduating from college, my sister refused to find a steady job. She constantly claimed she wasn't born to sit in an office and wanted to live a more creative life. Her attitude didn't change even after she married her husband. He worked in sales, but his performance was poor, and his income alone couldn't support her spending habits, so I began paying their rent. At first, it was only supposed to be until they got back on their feet, but that period stretched into 3 years. When she tearfully pleaded that his parents were getting older and needed a car for hospital visits and grocery trips, I gave in again. I made the down payment for the large SUV and even covered the monthly loan payments. It wasn't out of kindness. It was my way of preventing future excuses and to avoid the day they would come asking for money under the pretext of caregiving. I placed the glass back on the table and added new logs to the fireplace. The flames roared back to life, crackling softly in the quiet room. As I listened to the fire, I questioned everything. I had always believed I was acting out of a sense of duty as an older sister, but perhaps I was the one who turned her into someone incapable of standing on her own. She had always been clever at using tears as a weapon and finding someone else to blame whenever things went wrong. Every time our parents gave in, eventually so did I when she got married. I secretly hoped her husband would succeed where I had failed and keep her grounded. But that hope was shattered. He was even weaker than her, preferring comfort over confrontation. Rather than stop her spending, he benefited from it to mask his own lack of success. Together, they leaned on me, feeding off my goodwill like a perfect example of parasitic coexistence. When she called me a parasite, it wasn't just a drunken slip. It was her truth, stripped of any pretense. She had no gratitude, only entitlement and contempt for the one who provided. I had been afraid of losing the last thread of family, but now there was no turning back. I was cutting away the illusion. Christmas morning arrived with perfect stillness and endless white snow. My phone remained turned off. For the first time in years, I was beginning a true holiday, free from obligation. I spent the following week secluded in the cabin, wrapped in quiet. I read while gazing at the snow, cooked elaborate meals for myself, and watched films at night with a glass of wine. I didn't think about them. Their future was no longer my concern. When the holiday ended and I returned to my office in the city, reality was waiting. The property management company called to say my sister and her husband hadn't paid their rent and couldn't be contacted. I told the manager to proceed with the standard protocol, issue the payment demand, and the eviction notice as scheduled. I made it clear there would be no extensions or exceptions. That afternoon, I received an email from the finance company with a photo of the white SUV being towed away. I dragged the email straight to the trash and returned to work, feeling no emotion at all. A few weeks later, my sister called from an unknown number. Her voice was weak and strained. She called me cruel for kicking them out and taking the car. She said living at her in-law's house was unbearable because the mother threw insults at her daily, while the husband blamed her for everything. I told her she was simply facing the consequences of her own choices. She screamed that they couldn't survive on his salary alone because he was useless and never got promoted. Then I heard her husband's voice in the background, yelling that she burned through every dollar he made like water. Their argument erupted into screaming and accusations, the sound of two people tearing each other apart. I listened to their ugly fight without feeling a thing. Then a loud crash echoed through the phone, something hitting the floor, and the call went dead. I quietly set my phone down. The second movement of their collapse had begun. I later heard that he officially filed for divorce. There was no alimony or division of assets because there was nothing left to divide. When spring arrived, she called one last time. Her voice was thin and frail as she apologized and begged for another chance because we are sisters. I looked out at the calm spring scenery and gave her one last piece of advice. I told her that the next time she found herself in trouble, she should call the police officers like she did that night, as maybe they would take her side this time. Before she could reply, I ended the call and blocked her number. There are no more parasites in my life. From now on, I will fully embrace the freedom I have earned, the quiet beauty and the life that is finally, completely mine.